It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart breaks there.
Thanks very much. Thank you, first of all, for turning out in such huge numbers today. I think this represents the rude health of the WFA. If any other academic or scholarly conference can get this sort of numbers on a wet November afternoon, then I'd like to see them. And I hope the centenary coming up will encourage such numbers to carry on and continue. I'd like to first of all say what an honour it is to be president after distinguished predecessors like John Terrain and Bill Barnett. After my illness this year, I'm glad to be anywhere, but I'm particularly glad to be here today. The conference snuck up behind me in a sense because John and Colin just said, don't be anywhere other than Tally-Ho on the 3rd of November. And I said, why? They said, it's the President's Conference. So I said, well, as President, thank you for telling me before. I think to return to the health of the WFA as the centenary approaches, which is going to involve all of us, I think, in a lot of hard work, but rewarding hard work. I just pause to reflect on our activity level at the moment, and sat down with the latest issue of the bulletin and counted in the notes advertising meetings. There were no less than 175 branch meetings actually advertised in the bulletin, with 111 different speakers. I think that says a tremendous amount for the energy and devotion of all the branches, not only in Britain but also elsewhere. And some speakers, including one of our speakers today, seem to be hogging the limelight. Rob Thompson, Bryn Hammond and John Derry, I notice, all down for 6 talks each. Suggests they ought to get out more, I think. But again, it pays tribute, I think, to the activity levels. Well, I'm going to introduce our first distinguished speaker today, who's suffering from a severe case of the lurgy, apparently. So we'll stay. If we stay away from Bob physically, it doesn't mean to say we don't love you anymore, Bob. Bob Bushaway, in fact, I think it was Bob that introduced me to John Bourne in this incestuous world that is military history. I'm not quite sure who's to blame for this, but I'm glad we did all get together. Bob studied history at the University of Southampton, where he gained a first-class honours degree and a doctorate before he proceeded to a career in senior management at Birmingham. He's published on the remembrance in the Great War and has taught, I think a lot of us have come in contact with this annual residential school for the last 20 years or so.
That's possible, yeah.
Principally at Ludlow, now elsewhere.
That was
on a variety of, first of all, topics, and each one of those, if you attended them, was a tour de force from Bob, who holds sway for most of the weekend and puts us firmly in our place if we transgress. And also, I think I treasure Bob's contributions to the twice yearly Saturday schools, which he and John have carried off at Birmingham for so many years. With the, I think we ought to pay tribute to the invaluable help of Cal Sweet here, who's also on duty today, I'm glad to say. I noticed that Bob is a historical advisor to the BBC TV series Land Girls. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. He's also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute. I presume he's the only fellow of that here today. He's currently working on a social and cultural history of the ordinary British soldier. It's a big called Glum Heroes.
Glum Heroes, isn't it?
And also, I think he co-edited very skillfully with John what I regard as one of the best ever memoirs of the First War, Joffrey's War, which I'm sure John will sell you to reduce cost if you ask him nicely. One of truly, I think they've both done an outstanding job editing what is a very, very heavyweight memoir. And we'll be on a football theme here today. Bob is a supporter of Chelsea. Not a proper football team, like John and I support. But, so there we go. Bob Bushaway, welcome.
Let me first begin by apologising for the state of my health. I took a half-term break with my partner in Paris and underestimated both the virulence of the air circulation system on the plane, which actually should have had written alongside it, guaranteed influenza spreader. And then I underestimated the challenge of the temperatures in the streets of Paris when I had packed a wardrobe more for Saint-Tropez in May or June. I think I'd really needed a wardrobe for Siberia in December. So between those two things, I've come down with a nasty touch of the lurg, for which I do apologise. I'll try my best to overcome it as I speak, but I probably will fade pretty quickly afterwards, so get your questions in the question time, because I probably certainly won't be around later on this afternoon, returning to my bed, as they say. I'm always struck by the angst in this country that we give to the subject of history, the quality of its teaching, the content of the syllabus. We forever seem to be tinkering with it to make history bear a number of other almost ahistorical functions, rather vague things like sense of citizenship, the idea of pride in our nation and so forth. And yet again, we are in the midst of a major overhaul of the A-level curriculum, in which the illustrious body Ofsted has pronounced that in their view the subject should have more of the content of making us feel proud of our past, and indeed celebrating rather than just commemorating great days of achievement or great years of success as a nation that perhaps we have forgotten about. The problem with this, of course, is it reveals all too quickly one of the basic failures with the historiography of our past, and particularly the British historiography of the First World War, which is that we have a very distorted view, a curiously distorted view of what actually went on, where, when and how, and no more so is that applicable to the year 1915. Whilst in Paris, as is my wont when I find myself there, I visited the Musée de l'Armée Française, Les Invalides, and if you walk around the galleries of the First World War in that French museum, you don't recognise the chronology of the war, the events that we endlessly dwell upon through the eyes of French historians. French historians give very little credence to anything British on the Western Front at any point, for that matter, and certainly not really until the appointment of Foch as Supreme Commander in 1918. In the gallery that purports to cover the events of 1915, the most regularly mentioned British contribution to the war is the Gallipoli campaign and the Dardanelles, which of course is largely a completely forgotten piece of history as far as the French are concerned, notwithstanding the fact that some 20,000 French soldiers were killed on the peninsula and lie there in now what must be the least visited cemetery in the world, I suspect, judging by the visitors' book. So when we talk about recasting what we tell our young people about the past, I think we must always be conscious of the fact that history is not the possession of one nation or one people. It is in fact the outcome of the interactions between events and between those with interest in those events. And this is no different for our study of the First World War. And we need to recast, I think, and hopefully this conference will begin that process. We need to recast our views to set back into context the reality of each of the years of the war. 1915, of course, is not without its resonances, as was pointed out at the time, for the British when looking at earlier years. Of course, it was in 1915, we witnessed the 500th anniversary of the Battle of Agincourt, not an inter-allied celebration of great moment between France and Britain. We also celebrate the centenary of Waterloo in 1815, another event which our French allies neglected to congratulate us on at the time. And indeed, I can remember staggering manfully through a French text on Waterloo and reading it page by page as well as I could, my reading French not being too bad, only to get to the end and realise that in fact the French lost. And it kind of gets covered in the last paragraph in about 4 lines. Up until then, you are reading an account of French triumph and French victory. And that tells you something, I think, about the French attitude to war and also to the French perception of their past, which is to see it as a series of events around the doings of great personalities or great individuals. And if there is an architect for 1915, in that we might, for example, as a result of this conference, discuss and agree upon, who were the key driving personalities of each of the years of the war, it is undoubtedly true that the architect of 1915 is General Joseph Joffre. Papa Joffre, recent hero of the miracle on the Marne in 1914, which undoubtedly averted disaster, impending disaster on the Western Front. although it's doubtful whether the German movement would have not faltered at some other point, at some later stage, even without Joffre's radical rethinking of the circumstances he found himself in. A colonial soldier, an imperial soldier, whose entire career prior to this had essentially been defending France's substantial imperial holding around the world. Another factor to comment on, perhaps as a hint towards what we might expect, an engineer. An engineer in the same way that we found our own Secretary of State for War as a Royal Engineer. And I think there's something about 1915 which is about the engineering of warfare, of the battlefield, the attempt to create on the battlefield the situation which most suited those who wish to take the initiative by engineering the solution in a series of semi-permanent, fixed or temporary field fortifications on an elaborate scale, and more as the year goes on. And perhaps en passant, we should again remember that this is the nation of perhaps the greatest military engineer of all time, Vauban, a man of whom it was said nothing he laid siege to withstood the siege, and nothing he defended ever fell to siege. We might ponder for a moment on the extent to which France's survival during the 17th century and then expansion during the 18th was to some extent the legacy of Vauban, whose statue I think is rightly at the corner of the Les Invalides complex. So if it's Joffre's war in 1915, Peter's also reminded me that it was also Joffre's war in 1915. And if I can play the game with you as we go of talking about the ground view and the bird's eye view of war, then you couldn't pick a better pairing than that. Private Geoffrey Husbands, who, as Peter's mentioned, his memoir John and I have just published, is barely touched by the war in 1915. He doesn't, in fact, enlist until May. He spends the months that remain in 1915 in various training camps. He doesn't proceed to France until March of 1916. In fact, in keeping with, if you like, Kitchener's original plan for the expansion of the British Army, which is underway during 1915. So both in Joffre's war and Joffre's war, we can perhaps detect something of the texture of 1915. And for me, there are two major significant developments in 1915 which mark the war and characterize it for its remaining period. The first is we see the transition irrevocably from a regional conflict to a global conflict. Regional in the sense that when the war begins, it starts out very much as a series of linked regional disputes or conflicts, which are only really made global by the imperial dimension. And that leads me to the second thought, that the war becomes global. The war also becomes a war that touches the peoples of the world in a very direct sense and in a way that you could argue perhaps warfare had not done in the past. For that reason, in my view, I think the First World War rightly deserves that title, the First World War. Until the end of 1914, contemporaries referred to the war as the European War for Civilization, or some such phrase as that. Afterwards, it may have been referred to as the war in Europe, particularly from the viewpoint of our American cousins. But once you get through to 1915, the circumstances are such that we are dealing with a world war. A war, well, what do we mean by that? Let's be clear. We mean a war that takes place to a significant extent, both on land and by sea, where military and naval operations include amphibious operations, force projection, where maritime blockade and the effects of economic warfare at sea are sought. Warfare taking place simultaneously in several different theatres of operations, and those theatres of operations integrated, not in a haphazard or chance way, but by an overarching strategy. Undoubtedly, it must involve warfare with allies, coalition warfare. And getting to grips with that is going to remain one of the big challenges, indeed, for both the Entente and the Central Powers in 1915. Realising that you're only as good as your allies, or that what your allies choose to do or not do will have effects for you, is something which, for example, the Imperial German Army has to accept in both world wars, firstly coming to the aid of Austria-Hungary, who find a little difficulty even in defeating Serbia in 1915 on their own, and also in the Second World War coming to the aid of Italy, whose own expansionist ideas were not necessarily part of any German starting plan. One of the characteristics of the year that we sometimes put in a little box marked shell shortages, or the scandal of the shell shortage, as if this is some kind of local difficulty that might well have been dealt with better. What we're talking about here is a worldwide challenge placed upon all of the combatants in production, in supply, and in distribution of the means for sustaining warfare. And where there is a significant imperial context, there must, it follows, be a significant amount of fighting, both in and over imperial possessions. The continent of the war, that until recently historians have basically ignored, and particularly at their peril in 1915, has been Africa, where in fact you're engaged in all kinds of warfare, from the suppression of rebellion to outright conquest, and the possession of colonies previously held by others. Those African sideshows, that awful word, which comes out of the debate about Easterners and Westerners, which I think, again, we can now shelve as making any contribution to our understanding. engage both men, material, and munitions on a considerable scale. What's more, they also involve the arming and enlistment of large numbers of colonial troops or troops from what will eventually be the emerging states of that continent and other continents, and bring them into the war. And that brings me really to my third idea about 1915, which is this is the year that begins to see the war's impact upon the movement of people around the globe. Partly as a result of the requirements of the war, the bringing together of large labour forces to provide the manpower necessarily to give logistic muscle to the war, but also in the form of armed forces themselves. And then also what you might call the bystander effect. Those people who, for no particular good reason, find themselves not flavour of the month. I don't intend to debate, for example, today, the whys and wherefores, or indeed the rightness or justice or otherwise of matters like the Turkish Armenian massacres, but it's certainly true that in February of 1915, Enver Pasha moves all his Armenian troops from the status of combatant to the status of labour battalion, effectively forced labour. And that begins a process of essentially what we would now call ethnic cleansing, from which the controversies still echo. So, what can we then say about the nature of this global war? I'll begin, I think, with the words of Geoffrey Husbands himself, who I think recognises, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, when the memoirs were written, that the decision he had taken in May of 1915 to enlist was both irrevocable and enormous in terms of its impact, not just on his life, but on the life of those around him and on his whole future. He said in the diary, in the memoir rather, I had stepped through those gates a few hours before the gates to the barracks, a civilian. I passed them now, a member of His Majesty's forces, a duly enlisted private of the Chatsworth Rifles, the 16th Service Battalion, Sherwood Foresters, Notts and Derby Regiment, bound to the service of my country, come storm, come calm, come toil, come rest, come life, come death. And then quoting the Latin tag, vestigia nulla restrorum, he ends that reflection, perhaps colloquially to translate with no going back. Now, no going back could be the epithet for everyone concerned in 1915. I don't think we subscribe any longer, quite as readily as we once did, to the view that the vast majority of those who go to war in August of 1914 think somehow or other the war will be a short one and over by Christmas. I think the Christmas myth has now been put to rest pretty much. What is true, though, is that the war, the idea that the war will now take a long time, grows on most of those concerned. Indeed, French historians have the habit of writing about the First World War in two parts. They often will lump the experiences of 1914 together with, if you like, the experiences which had gone before with the French army of the Third Republic, certainly back as far as the Dreyfus affair at the beginning of the 20th century. And then a second volume they will actually see as beginning 1915 to 1918. So in other words, you get two definite approaches to the war. One in 19th century terms, or the terms, if you like, that warfare had once been defined by, and then what you might call the new warfare, modern warfare, coming with the beginning of 1915. Now, we can pay our money or take our choice as to what aspects from 1915 onwards we would characterize as defining that break, as defining that coming of modern warfare. I guess the one that's most frequently cited is the arrival of chemical weapons, both in the East and on the Western Front in 1915, as far as the British were concerned, with the advent of the use of gas at Second Ypres in April of 1915. We might look at the coming of field fortifications, which I've already mentioned, and the war in fixed positions. We might look at the transformation of armies themselves in terms of their numbers, their equipment, even their uniforms. The French bidding farewell to their red trousers and adopting their horizon blue uniforms. For the group, I think, who most experienced that transformation, it strikes me that it's the French army that has the most distance to travel. If you look at the pre-war Zouaves or the pre-war Alpini, and then look how they're transformed by the war into the uniforms, if you like, of everybody else, a lot of that gloire is inevitably transformed by the war. That the war would therefore be different from what had gone before doesn't just so emerge on the 1st of January 1915 with some sudden revelation. Joseph Joffre recognized the difficulty that the Western Front provided for him in terms of any strategy that could be adopted. And he simply took the view that the only strategy that was practical was summed up in three French words: je les grignon. I shall gnaw at them like a bone, like something that would have to be broken down bit by bit by bit. Is that the origin, if you like, of a concept of attrition? Well, maybe not, but it's certainly the origin of something that says Plan 17 is gone forever. The trouble was, for the French, that gnawing at them at the tactical level often involved tactics that were barely different in character from those of 1914. You might say that for the British, this problem wouldn't have arisen because not having had the direct continental experience of warfare in the 19th century, part fleetingly in the Crimean War, I guess, not having taken the field in Europe since 1815, we were not replacing that previous experience except in its imperial or colonial context. But if you look at the great British contribution to 1915, the Gallipoli expedition is essentially conceived of as a 19th century amphibious operation, and indeed begins with all of the hallmarks of the kind of pre-war planning and the exercises that would go into pre-war strategic training that every naval officer and a good number of army officers would have studied under the question, could the Dardanelles be forced? There was hardly anyone who would not have studied that problem in military terms. But it was conceived of as a 19th century problem, and it stands really in relationship to the war as it is to come, in a way that makes it now seem out of place. Gallipoli, time and time again, demonstrated that the lessons of artillery, the lessons of the avoidance of frontal assault, the power of the machine gun were such that you simply could not expect an army to give way against concentrated attack in the open without cover and without supporting fire or suppressing fire. There's an anecdote of Gallipoli, which I always like to recall at this point, of a New Zealand regiment arriving by night before Hill 60 to join the attack there, and being briefed by the brigade major, who says, tomorrow morning at dawn, we will attack with the bomb and the bayonet. And a New Zealand officer new to this whole business says, but sir, we don't have any bombs. The brigade major paused and says, tomorrow morning we will attack with the bayonet. And that kind of simple idea that you make do and mend, that you go with what you have, was very much part and parcel of a transforming state of military affairs, and in one in which just putting up with conditions was what was expected of you, rather than anything more challenging. But the coordination of fronts becomes the problem in 1915, and not just for Germany. We often present the opening of the First World War as somehow the two-front war is a dilemma for Germany alone, and of course it is not. It remains a dilemma for the Entente in just the same way. You could argue that even the genesis of an operation like Gallipoli has its origins in an attempt to somehow help our Russian ally. I think, again, we perhaps now set aside the importance of the Russian cry for help at the end of 1914. But nonetheless, you can see that if you're sitting from the position of the Entente, what Russia does or doesn't do becomes also as important to you as what Austria-Hungary does becomes to the Germans. If we look anywhere on the Eastern Front in 1915, we see substantial movements of troops, large numbers of forces, large numbers of divisions, and movement on a scale that is simply not to be seen on the Western Front again until 1918, and even then on a far smaller scale. In the end, for Germany, 1915 represents a defeat in the East, because Falkenhayn's idea that by combining concentration and manoeuvre, he can destroy the Russian armies in the field simply does not prove possible. And although Russia does indeed suffer great losses, both in men and materiel, the factor of geography and distance allows for withdrawal as the means of preserving the front. And although Warsaw falls, although finally Serbia is defeated and its remnant has to be transported to the island of Corfu, despite these things, there is no way that Falkenhayn's strategy of victory in the East can be said to have been achieved in 1915. For Joffre, at Chantilly, attempting to coordinate strategy with Russia, other than simply to say simultaneous offensives, was practically impossible. Across such a distance, any idea of coordinating operations in some vast double envelopment just was not feasible. Equally, the grand strategic thought that lies, if anything does lie, behind Gallipoli and the Dardanelles, that by opening a major front against Turkey, with the possibility of a Turkish capitulation, that will open up the possibility of envelopment of the Central Powers from the East, again, is largely a matter of pie in the sky and can only be seen as conjecture. Intimidating the Sultan or bribing the Sultan, the traditional 19th century way of seeking the compliance of the Ottoman Empire, had long since passed. One of the failures of pre-war diplomacy in the years running up to 1914, I think, is the failure of the British Foreign Office to understand and come to terms with the Young Turk revolution, and to see in those young and vigorous army officers now running Turkey that in fact they were dealing with a different kettle of fish than had been the case for the previous 100 years. Not a case, I think, of know your enemy, but know your friend in that context. And that leads, I think, to one of the underlying directions of 1915, which is the search for allies. The big prize, of course, falling to the Entente in April of 1915 with the entry of Italy into the war. Italy, a member of the Triple Alliance, many had thought would simply declare war with the rest of the alliance in 1914, but who did not do so on the grounds that Austria-Hungary had not consulted with Italy on their ultimatum to Serbia, and preferring neutrality at that point, enters the war on the basis of a long and detailed negotiated treaty, most of whose clauses were initially secret, in which, well, you can only say a classic case of not counting your chickens until they're hatched. because this was a case of promising Italy all kinds of post-war concessions in return for their military support. But of course, none of those concessions could yet be made without the war being first won. And a bit like most of the Anglo-French international relations of the period, it's very easy to promise different people different things, even if they're contradictory, because you might never have to meet the need of them coming into being. And the trouble was, many of them came home to roost after 1918 and Versailles. What Italy's entry to the war immediately does is provide another front, a front in which Italy, crossing into Austro-Hungarian territory, could open up a significant possibility against what was already being perceived as the least stable of the central powers. And the problem with this, though, was that operationally speaking, as again was discovered in the Second World War, the ground was difficult. The barrier of the Alps, the steep river declines and valleys meant that fighting here was not exactly an easy task. But if you add the Italian front to the other fronts of the war, by the end of 1915, you now have a significant number of new fronts. And this is not to mention in any way those African operations which I talked about at the beginning. At the end of 1914, there were essentially the three fronts, West, East, and Balkans. But by the end of 1915, you're fighting in the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, you're in a defensive position, Britain having unilaterally annexed Egypt in December 1914, in the Sinai and the Suez Canal, and you have the other fronts, including Italy, Austro-Hungary, to deal with at the same time. Now, what about that overarching and integrated strategy? Were these fronts all being fought in some kind of coordinated way? Well, sadly, of course, no. The biggest failure of 1915 is not military, but is governmental. It is the inability to manage the war in a unified and strategic way. The Indian Army were fighting the campaign in Mesopotamia largely as an India Office and Government of India activity, pretty much off their own bat. In the case of the Italian entry to the war, that left Italy pretty much on her own to think about what might be achieved. The Admiralty thought they could be as effective on land as at sea, and spent most of the first half of 1915 stooging around for an operation that would contribute significantly to winning the war on land, having rejected the North German plain, a wise move, I feel, and Gallipoli resulting, and then France's own wish to give direct support to Serbia, which led to the opening of the Salonika operations in 1915. All of these are really the government's decisions being taken, not in any overarching strategic way, but in a kind of pragmatic way, in the context of Macmillan's events, dear boy. These are the way it went. It's worth reflecting, for example, as far as Britain was concerned, Serbia were never, ever identified as an ally from start to finish, always seen as more of a French interest than anybody else's. And the idea, of course, of spheres of influence, a very 19th century great power concept, in which you have congresses to divide up the world, in which you had a congress at one stage to divide up Africa. These linger on into 1915 and cannot possibly provide a means, a mechanism for overarching victory, and not against a nation with the economic strength of Imperial Germany, a nation that was going to require several years of warfare before defeat. The ally that might have been, in my view, in 1915, of course, was Greece. On what evidence the contemporaries would have based that view is very difficult now to ascertain. But when it finally dawned, for example, on Sir Winston Churchill, that they would need some kind of force on the land side of the campaign in Gallipoli, Churchill's first idea was a Balkan army of 50,000, led by a Balkan League type structure, led by Greece. There was one slight difficulty with this plan, and that was that although the Greek Prime Minister of the time, Venizelos, was pro-Entente, pro-British, the monarchy was at best neutral and probably more pro-German, not least because King Constantine's wife was the sister to the Kaiser. Now, I know that blood in the First World War does not stop nations going to war against each other, but it seems an unlikely occurrence. And in fact, the idea that somehow the Balkans could be made to rise up and sweep against the remaining sort of Ottoman occupation of the European mainland was just so wrong-headed as to defy belief. Now you say to yourself, well, how could this be? Surely they had expertise. Surely they had people who knew the situation on the ground and who could advise them better than this. Well, of course, the answer to that is, of course, they did. If I take an example of a pro-Turkish advisor in Doughty Williams in the case of the Turks, you get to a situation where not only is he not listened to, but he ends up actually doing the one thing he would have wanted to have regretted all his life, which was taking up arms against the Turks themselves. And when Doughty Wiley goes ashore on the morning of the 26th of April to try and pull the irons out of the fire on V Beach, he does so refusing to carry any small arms with him so that he does not run the risk of shooting a Turkish soldier by mistake. Now, these are people who had dedicated their lives in their various parts of the civil service or the War Office or the Admiralty to understanding the world as it was and not as it might appear from Whitehall, or even worse, as they might want it to appear. You can almost call 1915 a year of illusion or a year of delusion, because in that sense there is a lack of reality, not just the bombs for those New Zealanders at Hill 60, but right the way through the piece. not accepting the world as it was and not attempting to identify an overarching strategy that could be usefully employed to win the war itself, I think shows that although for the French historians 1915 is put in that part 2 bracket, it's still very much rooted in part 1 of our understanding of the First World War. Looking at your groaning table of books over in the corner for sale, I happened upon the one of those kind of Great War year-by-year books. And if you read the entries for 1915, it reads like a stamp album. They're just isolated events without any context linking them or in any sense bringing them together. So, and what are those events? Well, you could be as astute as I can in guessing them. The Lusitania. So what's all that about? Unrestricted submarine warfare, economic warfare at sea, the blockades. One of the few sustained strategic policies that dates back to 1914. On both sides for that matter, although of course the Germans abandoned unrestricted submarine warfare in October 1915 because of the bad press they're getting with the American neutral state. Right, well that two-finger gesture from Colin indicates I think I'm into my last 5 minutes, or I think that's what it indicates, Colin. Yeah, that's right. So I'll bring these remarks to conclusion. Questions like, could the war have been won in 1915, are just completely non-starters. There could be the idea that diplomacy could be reimposed, some vast negotiation that was going to satisfy everybody from Italy to Greece to Southwest German rebels, Southwest African German rebels, that was going to satisfy the French requirement to remove an occupying force from 1/6 of its territory, or that the Germans were ready to agree to that. All of this is completely miles away. What lay ahead was what I suspect Geoffrey knew lay ahead when he took that fateful decision to pass through those barrack gates on the 31st of May 1915, which was a lot of long and hard fighting. As the French put it, the First World War becomes the war that lasts a long time, and not the model of the 19th century short war with limited objectives, largely won through diplomacy at the end of the day. So I'm going to end my remarks there. I'll just about handle a few questions, and then I think my voice will completely have gone, for which again I apologise.
Neat reply to Irish Paddy-O, saying Mike Maloney wants to marry me, and so leave the Strand and Piccadilly, or you'll be to blame. For love has fairly drove me silly, hoping you're the same. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, let us swear. It's a long, long way great of Tipperary, but my